Hi there, Steve Kaufman here. Today was a heavy Korean learning day. I am preparing for my trip. I'm going to Boston tomorrow to the American Conference of Teachers of Foreign Languages convention there. And so I went through a lot of Korean texts, looking words up in a dictionary so that they're socked in as saved links on my iPad and my iPhone so that I can study them offline. I went through basically just saving the blue words. Now I've got a bunch of yellow words. I'm going to read through the text while I'm on the airplane. And I got my handy Korean history textbook with the Chinese characters. But today I want to ramble a bit because I want to refer to, there's reference here in the comments to a blog post by a person who essentially attacked all the principles of input-based learning, Stephen Krashen and so forth. So I want to ramble a bit in response to this blog post. Since I'm going to Boston, I'm going to have a blast there with all these teachers and people who are interested in languages. And I am a supporter of Stephen Krashen, who's going to be there, by the way. I'm looking forward to meeting him there. But here is what this person had to say. This person's name is Gianfranco Conti, co-author of the Language Teacher Toolkit, winner of the 2015 Best Resource Contributor Award, blah, blah, blah. And he is a PhD in Applied Linguistics, MA in Teaching English as a Foreign Language, MA in Literature, English Literature, and so forth and so on. His point is that there are 5 mixed messages which have severely damaged modern language education, and he basically blames Stephen Krashen. And the first of these is the idea that we shouldn't teach grammar because we should learn like children, and children learn subconsciously. Well, it's an oversimplification. Of course, we don't learn like children because we have our life experience and our vocabulary in our own language, which the children don't have. But there are many things that the children do that we can imitate, and that is exposing ourselves to a lot of content. And it isn't that we shouldn't teach any grammar, but I believe that we shouldn't expect that because we teach grammar, people are going to get it right. A lot of grammar is very immune to explanation, correction, and so forth and so on. I know this all the time. We see people who can't get the third person singular, the present tense right after 10 or 15 years of grammar instruction. He do, he go, she go. I always mention Chinese people who after 10, 15 years or longer still say my husband, she. It just takes a while for these things to sink in. And the more sort of framework, reference framework we have, the more the grammar instruction is relevant. So I think that number 1 point, Krashen emphasizes meaningful input as a major contributor to language acquisition. I think Krashen is right, and our friend Gianfranco is wrong. The second point he says is, don't use the first language in the classroom. I don't need to go through all of it, but I agree with you. I think where necessary, use the first language in the classroom. If you're teaching Spanish, person doesn't understand what you're saying, use some English, let them even answer in English. And also dictionaries. I always prefer a bilingual dictionary as opposed to one that's the monolingual dictionary where the dictionary definition contains a lot of words that, again, I don't understand. So that's true. I'll go for that. The third point he says is that a myth that's damaging, right? And his point is that somehow it's since the 70s, since learner-based instruction and Krashen, that everything has gone to hell. Well, I studied language in the language learning in the 50s. People didn't learn in Montreal. All the people in the English school system didn't learn to speak French any more than they do now. And what's more, language instruction is still heavily grammar focused. That hasn't changed. That's the most common complaint that I get from people at Link or on my YouTube channel. So, but then he says, another myth is that it's not important for students to understand all they read or hear. Well, there's all kinds of research, and I've mentioned the professor Robert Bjork, who points out that we shouldn't try and force ourselves to understand something. We should interleave. We should do a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and go back to the other. And if we learn and forget, we're going to learn better than if we try to force ourselves to learn something, to master it. As he says, to master 90-95% of it. I think the main thing is to do things that you find interesting, stimulating, and move on. As long as you're motivated to try and understand a bit more, stay with it. But once you find it boring or uninteresting, move on to something else. So it's not necessary. He says you have to understand 99.5% of the text before moving on. I don't believe that. But I can see that in a classroom context, that might be something to strive for. Then he says, another myth is that teachers must be tolerant of mistakes. I think the main thing, again, is to get people communicating. Some mistakes are not going to correct themselves, no matter how much you correct people. I have done it, tutoring people via Skype. You correct them, they come right back with the same mistake. Same with me. I make a mistake, tutor corrects me, sends it, on my link conversation report, and the same mistake is corrected in the following conversation. It takes a long time. And the bulk of these mistakes, we correct them ourselves after enough exposure. So teachers not necessarily be tolerant of mistakes, but it's not a big deal to make mistakes. So that's also, and he says that if the teachers tolerate mistakes, the mistakes will be fossilized, will be ingrained in the learner. But what does that mean? If the bulk of what the learner is doing is listening and reading, if I'm listening to stuff, if I'm reading, how am I ingraining errors? If you don't demand of me that I produce the language all the time, which I think is unnecessary at an early stage, I'm not going to ingrain any errors. But I might just be enjoying what I'm listening to and reading. And the final one he says is that another myth is that pronunciation is not important. It's only important to be understood. Well, again, it's like this issue of grammar. It's not no grammar, but it's how much emphasis do you put on grammar? So how much emphasis should you put on pronunciation? Should you make people self-conscious about their pronunciation, particularly early on? I find that it takes a long time for me to get used to the intonation of the language, the pronunciation, and some things that I don't notice in the pronunciation at an early stage, I start to notice later on. So when I can hear things better and I notice things better, I believe I have a better chance of pronouncing them better. So again, if the teacher is forcing people to speak in the classroom, wants them to speak correctly, he's irritated by their mistakes, he's irritated by their poor pronunciation, maybe that's an issue. But if you can get people to learn, and here again, his assumption is that kids won't read, kids won't just listen. But my grandchildren who went to French immersion, they had to read on history and chemistry and physics and math in French, and they did it. So you can get kids to do that. And maybe instead of questioning them on every detail and making sure they correctly answer questions about what happened in a particular bit of reading that they did, if you simply said, again, if they're using link, make sure they create links on every page so they're looking words up, but also write a bit about your impression of what you read, to show that you read it, essentially, and use some of the words that you learned. And we won't mark you down for grammar mistakes, and we won't mark you down for misimpressions about what happened in the story. We just want you to use the language and show that you listened and read and you enjoyed it. And maybe your interpretation is different than the, call it the correct interpretation, but you enjoyed that engagement with the language. Enough. So, in other words, I think that it all boils down to what this lady, who I hope I will see in Boston and whom I met in San Diego the last time I attended one of these conferences, Dr. Mary Ann Lyman Hagar, who at that time was the head of the Language Acquisition Resource Center at San Diego State University, and who said there are only three things that matter in language learning: the attitude of the learner, the time spent with the language, and developing the ability to notice. And I think that developing the ability to notice comes from spending the time, comes from having the right attitude, and those are the only things that matter. So essentially, I reject this criticism of Krashen. However, I do recognize that those people who like to go at language learning in some other way, with an emphasis on Anki or an emphasis on grammar, if that's what they enjoy doing, if that's what gets them to spend time with the language, if that's what turns their crank, therefore gives them a positive attitude, by all means, go for it. Anyway, I'm going for it. I'm going to Boston tomorrow morning, and bye for now.